It is true that Stanley Kubrick was not very fond of interviews. He didn't give that many in his life, but still there is a legend that he would not speak at all. It's not true. There are maybe 50 interviews with Kubrick altogether, which is not a small number compared to Terrence Malick, who has given 3 interviews in his life, and other directors who don't give any interview, or writers like Salinger. But it is true that Kubrick is not very willing to comment his films, because I think he's a visual genius, and he feels handicapped when he has to talk with words about something which is a visual experience. He thinks that automatically it diminishes the complexity of the images if you start to find words to express what he wants to say. Though he was a very intelligent man, even a philosopher, and he read a lot, and he was much more, I think, able to speak about his films than most filmmakers. But still, he had a kind of modesty about that. I don't think he wanted to build a legend, as people think. He didn't want to build a legend of the man who is unknown and so on. When you came to know him, as I did, because I met him several times, I went to his house, he was mostly a father with children, and his wife was a painter. He lived in a very big house with 80 rooms, with cats and dogs and so on, a little like a gentleman farmer. And he enjoyed the privacy, and what was important for him was his work. He devoted all the time that he had to his work and to his family. And of course, reading and looking at TV and listening to music, but all related somehow to his work. So for him, interviews were losing time somehow. It was not very necessary for him. And he thought that critics could look at his films and analyze them without any statements. I came to know him, I think, first time was an interview. It was not an interview, it was a phone conversation in 1968. I had just seen 2001, which came out in June in Leicester Square in London. I organized a conversation on the phone with him, not an interview, just to ask him for a few elements like photographs for Positif that I needed for a long article I was going to write. And he was I couldn't get his number at the first time, but he called me back at my hotel. And at the time he was already preparing Napoleon. He wanted to do Napoleon, a new Napoleon. And he wanted to ask me a number of questions. I was fortunate to have been a student in history. I knew history quite well, and I could tell him the various books of importance about Napoleon. So that caught his interest, that I could provide him information, because in fact he gave interviews more to ask you what he wanted than to answer your questions. So we spoke about the various schools of historians, the Marxists, the Royalists, the Napoleonists, and so on. And it went on well. And after that, I was young and a little insolent. So I said to Kubrick, I said, but Mr. Kubrick, why do you want to make another Napoleon? There have been so many. Mm-hmm. And he said, can you mention one good Napoleon film? So I answered like any student of film, like any critic, like anybody. I said, Abel Gance, Napoleon. And he said, are you serious? Have you seen the film? I said, yes. Well, if you look at the beginning of the film, you have Robespierre, full of powder on his face, looking like a mask. Danton, who is half drunk, and Marat, who is in his bath and taking away the insects that he has in his on his face. And he said, do you think it's a good way to represent the most extraordinary movement in the history of mankind, the French Revolution, which changes the whole history of the world? Is it a good summary to have these three caricatures? And then he said, when you saw the film, did you understand why Napoleon was the greatest strategist in the history of warfare? Did he explain to you the military genius, how he won the battles? I said, no, not at all. We don't understand on him. He said, so what's the point of making a film if you don't deal with the important aspect of the film, that is the military genius? He said, of course, the film is brilliant, with the balloon, the sky that photographs the earth, and the triple screen. All this is very good technically. It's a great novelty. But it does not make you understand Napoleon. And I understood from this conversation that the rule of Kubrick was, he was a film buff, like Truffaut, like Godard. He was a film buff. But as a film buff, every time he started a film, he wanted the film to be the best of its kind. Why make a film if you don't improve on all the other films? So if you make a science fiction film, it should be a science fiction film that will be superior to all science fiction films. If you make a horror film, you have to make a horror film which is superior to all the horror films. If you make a war film, like Full Metal Jacket or Path of Glory, it has to show the war in a way that has never been shown before. So Barry Lyndon, you must make a costume film, recreate the 18th century that never before anybody could do it, to be really in the 18th century. So that's how he functions. I mean, when Truffaut made 400 coups, he did not say, I will beat Rossellini, I will be better than Rossellini. When Godard made Abu Souf, he didn't say, I will be better than Nicolas Ray. They made films that they wanted to be in the line, perhaps a little different, but in the line of what they liked. Kubrick was as much a film buff as they, but he wanted to do every time to do the best he could, So this conversation made me understand one of the aspects of Stanley Kubrick. I don't think that he thought about directors. I think he admired Ophuls. The two directors he preferred when he was 25-year-old were Max Ophuls, because of the fantastic camera movements and so on, that he inspired him. He loved camera, long takes. And Kazan, he said he's the best American director we have now, in 1957, because he gets the best from actors. He's the best director of actors. But he didn't want to be better than Kazan. He wanted to make a better science fiction film than the other science fictions that he had seen. That's for sure. He didn't have in mind to be better than Chaplin and so on. No, there is an interesting thing that he said. He said, Eisenstein is a genius of form, of style. But what he says is very small, no interest. Chaplin is a genius of content. What he says about humanity is extraordinary, but the form is rather elemental. So he said the one who combines the genius, he didn't say himself, but he said, but I think he must have thought of himself. The one who combines the genius of Eisenstein in terms of the screen, the dynamics, the light, the editing, and the humanity and the complexity of Chaplin, he would be the best director. He never said he was the best director, but that was, I think, his reflection. And in fact, he did not like Eisenstein very much. I mean, he admired Eisenstein, but he thought the actors were like puppets. Because Kubrick, who was a great formalist, a man with a great science of images and montage and so on, he was also extremely interested in actors. He did not consider actors like Bresson or Sternberg, who considered that actors were puppets. No, he loved actors, and he was able to let the actors free. He was a man who was extraordinarily organized. Everything was planned, but he always let the possibility of improvisation. That is, Malcolm McDowell in Clockwork Orange. They were stuck. They didn't know what to do. The set was there. Everybody was on the set, and they didn't know how to screen, how to shoot the film when they raped the woman and torture Mr. Alexander, the writer in Clockwork Orange. They didn't know what to do. And then Kubrick said to Malcolm McDowell, do you have an idea? What kind of thing could you sing? And Malcolm McDowell started to tap dance, singing in the rain. That was not the idea of Kubrick. It was Malcolm McDowell, but he was ready to accept it. And when he shot Dr. Strangelove, a lot of Peter Sellers' 3 roles. You know, he played the English military, the President of the United States, and the German Nazi scientist. A lot of things were brought by Peter Sellers, and Kubrick was laughing. He could not stop laughing. He found it so funny. You know? So Kubrick was a combination of course, an extremely conscious director, but also open to life, that is, to the acting. I think Kubrick was. I think one of the emotions that really are at the center of his personality is fear. I think Kubrick was afraid all his life. He was also full of anxiety, even anguish. And I think he felt New York to be a dangerous place. He felt the danger everywhere. And so he decided to move to England. Also, he decided to move to England because he wanted a kind of isolation from the studio. The further away he was from the studio, the less their pressure could be. Maybe also he was not so well considered by the critical establishment, but I don't think it is the reason, because the big critics in America, for instance, when 2001 came out, but that was later, they attacked him the most incredible way. Pauline Kael, Andrew Sarris, Stanley Kaufman, all these people who were the most important critics said the film was terrible, stupid, without any interest. Variety said, this film is on the level of the Godzilla film made by the Japanese. And when he made Barry Lyndon, they say, when will Warner Brothers stop giving money to this man? He has made this horrible film, Barry Lyndon, which is a series of paintings and no life. So I don't think he was not so much respectful of the critics in general. He knew critics were important because they brought people in the theaters at the time, not anymore, but at the time it was important to have good reviews. But he appreciated a number of critics, of course. He trusted some of them. But he would be more interested to read a paper written by a young student in Minnesota who sent him an article, a paper she had done for the studies. He would show me these pieces and look, it's so much better than when you read in Le Monde or what you read in the New York Times. So, but I think the main reason is, well, of course there was one reason is that Lolita was banned in America. I mean, the project of Lolita, he didn't feel safe to shoot it, so he shot it in England. He shot Lolita in England, and then he decided to stay in England for the rest of his life. And he had a big house, 80 rooms. As I said, his wife was painting beautiful flowers and so on. He was painting nightmares, she was painting flowers. There was a nice balance between the two. When he came home, he had his 3 daughters, 2 of him and the other one he adopted. He followed everything on television. He had tapes sent to him before internet. He read a lot. He played some sports, but fundamentally, and he did everything at home. He had the editing room, and when he shot films around his house. All the films were shot around his house, except Barry Lyndon when he had to go to Ireland, and then he came back quickly because there were attacks and so on against the crew. No, I would like to go back to fear. I think if you look at his films, all of them speak about fear. Fear in marriage, fear in war, of course. And it's not original that war is the subject of half of his films. There is always a war. If not a war, it's a conflict. Of course, conflict is very good for cinema, because with conflict you have good material, but he was obsessed, he was fragile, and he was obsessed by the threats. At his house there was, don't do this, don't do that, don't do that, you know, and some people had written on the wall of his big house, don't. Because he was just, yes, he saw all the dangers, you know. His main influence, I think, was Freud, and particularly civilization and its discontent. And what Freud was saying, and what Nazism told us, what communism told us, what fascism told us, what Maoism told us, all the movements, the totalitarian movements, is that the civilization is a very small crust, very, very small. And under the crust, there is this boiling violence. And that man is half an animal and half an intelligent human. And, but the animal is always there, in the dark. He's coming to jump at you. This is how Kubrick saw life, and I think he's totally right. He's absolutely right, because the evolution of humanity, normally humanity should go more and more towards civilization, and the 20th century is the most murderous century of the whole history of humanity. The whole history. There's nothing comparable like the massacres, and our century is going to follow. So Kubrick was afraid of that, and all his films are about reason and irrationality, passion and reason. All his films deal with the conflict between passion and reason. That Barry Lyndon, it's a beautifully rational society with Mozart, wigs, even the war, everybody is in order, they walk towards death, but everything is perfect. You know, it's the ultimate civilization, the 18th century. And 10 years later, it's the terror. And there's blood flowing everywhere, people putting heads on the sticks and so on. So he knew that, and he was afraid in the daily life, and he was also afraid in the life of the universe. Dr. Strangelove is exactly that. You know, Dr. Strangelove is, you have the most extraordinary installation with everything is under control, and then one general becomes drunk or drugged, and he decides to launch a nuclear attack, and you see this humanity collapsing with humor, of course, you know, with a beautiful song at the end of Dr. Strangelove. But what he says really is that if you compare ancient Greece, you have a war between the Trojans and the Greeks. All right. What do they have? They have slings to throw stones. They have almost no weapon, really, a knife, a sword. And today, we are not more intelligent than the Greeks, 2,500 years ago. If a Greek in 2,500 years ago makes a mistake with his sword, he kills one person or two persons. Today, if the person, like the President of the United States, President of the USSR, and all these people talking on the phone like idiots, now these people can push a button and it's the end of the world. So we have made fantastic progress technically, but we have not made any progress mentally. The man is the beast as it was and as he will always be. And that's very pessimistic, and people don't accept that, because the left, at the time the left thought Kubrick was with us. Kubrick was with the left. He made Path of Glory, so he's a leftist. But you understand that he can't be a leftist because left is built on optimism. we will build a beautiful world. You know, but the world is the gulag, is Stalin is a utopian, look at the utopia, and so on. So he could not believe in utopia, he could not believe in the right, because he saw the right as exploiting people, making them poor, exterminating them, racism, anti-Semitism. So he could not be on the right. So he was an observer, he was a kind of philosopher who was looking, and he was like his father. His father was a doctor. His father did not want him to go to cinema, he wanted him to be a doctor, like a good Jewish father. I have a son, he has to be a doctor, but he didn't want to be a doctor, but he did the doctor's job. In other words, he did to the audience, be careful, you have to cure, you have to look at reality. He was a kind of mental doctor, an artist who was pointing out what was wrong with the world and what was wrong with the human being. So they were kind of cautionary tales. I think Kubrick, like all the great artists, you know, like Fellini, like Kurosawa, like Buñuel, like Bergman, like Renoir, like Visconti, all the great artists somehow manage to communicate with the audience. Sometimes they don't, because the film is not understood, but on the whole, all these artists have had a big audience, because I don't believe that when you work in the theater or in the cinema, which are spectacles, you can be a great artist with only 1,500 followers. That's absurd. It's for the critics. I don't belong to this critics group. I think the great artists are able, like Shakespeare, like Molière, like Chekhov, and like all the great filmmakers, they are able to communicate. And I think it's the greatest achievement when you can make a film which is palatable, which is enjoyed by peasants, workers, philosophers, doctors, students, businessmen, you know, whatever. Everybody can communicate with this kind of film. And this film, in the case of Kubrick and other directors, talk about very important issues. The problem of Kubrick is that he was able to make a film where the image, each image, refers to an idea, that the images are expression of ideas. If you have only ideas, it's dry, it's intellectual cinema, it's avant-garde, it's only for a small number of people. If you make only images, you are doing it for the masses who enjoy blood and things like that. But if you do an image which is referring to an idea, then you educate the audience, you make them think, you know. And I think that I believe very much in a sentence by a German philosopher of the 30s called Erwin Panofsky, who was a specialist of aesthetics. He said there are two dangers for an artist: to remain an old maid or to become a prostitute. And I think it's true for the artist. It's what he says for the artist is absolutely true. Fear. Fear. I think the choice of a subject is so important because, you know, in the case of Kubrick, not Chabrol makes 3 films a year, but in the case of Kubrick, when he chooses a subject, it means that he will spend 4 years of his life completely on this subject, and he's afraid what is going to be the good subject. He waits to fall in love. There are men who wait to fall in love all their life. They never find the girl. They wait to fall in love. They never found the perfection. All right. So in the case of Kubrick, he has made, of course, 13 films, and every time between the films was longer, because I think the way as he got older and older, he was more and more anxious about the final choice. Also, I must say, there were 2 films that he wanted to make in between. One was AI, which Spielberg was going to make, and another one called Aryan Papers, which was from a novel by Louise Begley about a woman, an aunt, and a nephew who ran away from the concentration camps in Poland, which he abandoned almost 4 weeks before shooting. And he had done everything, the costumes, the location scouting. So it's not 12 years, really. It's not 12 years. But again, I think he was the same. He was pondering, what should we do? What shall we make? But I think that what characterizes Kubrick for me also is that he's a self-taught person. He never went to the university. He could have, he tried to go to university, but he was barred because there were numerous clauses for women. It was in 1945, and because of the war, there was a lot of people coming back from the war who had to go to university, and everybody wanted. There were not enough rooms, and women also wanted to study. So Kubrick was rejected because he did not have good marks in school. So he was self-taught. He started by becoming a photographer at 16, selling a photo. Interestingly, a photo of a newspaper vendor looking very, very sad about the death of Franklin Roosevelt. You could see and he sold the photo $50 to Look magazine. It's interesting that the first work he made was about death, which was so important for him. But I think Kubrick was self-taught, and he was suspicious of formulated concepts, of ideas that everybody repeats. He looked always for novelty. He was under the influence of nobody. When you go to university, you are formed by a teacher who tells you what to think, and so on. I think the self-taught person, when the person is a genius, for me, for all of us probably, it's better to go to university because we are not geniuses. But when you are a real genius, the advantage of being self-taught is that your mind is not going to be disturbed, changed, molded by another person. You think for yourself with a total originality. And this is what Kubrick wanted. For instance, he never used professional screenwriters. Never. He did not want a Hollywood screenwriter who used formulas, who has worked with 10 directors and tends to do the same script. He wanted people fresh, novelists, Diane Johnson, Michael Herr, whatever, Arthur Clarke, all except the last one, Frederick Raphael, who was a professional writer, and it did not go along very well with him. But all the other were specialists of novels, not of screenplays. The music's the same. He always took musicians that had very little business contact with Hollywood. He wanted musicians like Kazan. He wanted musicians that were fresh and would bring him some music. He ordered, for instance, a music to Alex Snow for 2001, and he threw it away because he preferred then to choose recorded music that had been composed but not for the film, for something else, for a concert. So all his life, he has been working with independent-minded people, with a total free mind. I don't think that either Peter Sellers or Malcolm McDowell were alter egos of Kubrick. I think probably like all great artists, Kubrick projected in many of his characters some aspects of his mind, but definitely not his whole personality. No, but what is interesting about Kubrick's use of actors is that the acting in his film is never psychological. It's never an acting that goes into the details of the psychology, like Bergman, for instance, or like Claude Sautet in France, or like Antonioni. No. There are two opposite kinds of actors, which are both far away from the realistic acting. First, there is the expressionist, over-the-top actor, Peter Sellers, Malcolm McDowell, Jack Nicholson, Lee Ermey in Full Metal Jacket, the instructor, the actors who have a blank face, who show very little expression, Matthew Modine in Full Metal Jacket, Malcolm McDowell in Ryan O'Neal in Barry Lyndon, in a way perhaps less James Mason. James Mason is more, Lolita is a little apart, it's more psychological. But the actors, of course, Carl Delahaye in 2001, The Cosmonauts, who show absolutely no emotion at all, no psychology. So Kubrick went from extreme to extreme, always avoiding realism, because he was not interested in shooting the reality. For him, the reality it does not exist. It's always something beyond reality. He was more of an expressionist. He was more influenced by the great German cinema than by the realistic cinema. Though he could be very realistic, of course, in doing the sets. When he prepares 2001, it's scientifically absolutely realistic. So there was a mixture of realism in the context that he was shooting, but not realism in the way he viewed relationship between people. About his interest in Freud, the opposition between eros, the Greek concept, eros, love, and death, thanatos, there are two pulsions in the human being, and which are contradictory, which fight against each other, and they are not only in the human being; they are also in the universe. What Freud showed in his essay on discontent, he showed that there was a tendency in humanity towards self-destruction. He was doing that at a time when people were already talking about the atomic weapons. That there is an impulse towards death in society itself, not only in the human beings. And in Kubrick, you find that, of course, in Dr. Strangelove, which is the best illustration of civilization and its discontents. But you find this also in every behavior, in the love's relationship between Lolita and Humbert Humbert, where Lolita, in a way, wants to destroy Humbert Humbert, and Humbert Humbert, who in a way participates in his own destruction by staying with Lolita when he knows it's his doom. It's the same with Malcolm McDowell in Clockwork Orange, where you have, on the one hand, he loves to listen to the Hymn to the Joy by Beethoven and Schiller, this exaltation of humanity, and he uses that music to kill, like a beast. So you have always this double issue. The first film he made, not a good one, I must say, and he didn't like it either. Fear and Desire. It's the same. Fear, it was the title of his first film. Fear and Desire. I have no favorite Kubrick movie. It's easy to say that you have a favorite Bresson movie because he did the same film, which is great. I'm not against it. You can say the best Romer movie. There are some directors who have such a unity of style and story that you can say, even Renoir, who is a very varied director, you can say Rulers of the Game is a summary, but you cannot take a Kubrick film and say it summarizes all that Kubrick can do. No, because every film is so different from the other that there is no possibility to choose. But if you want me to tell you, I would say 3 films. 2001, Barry Lyndon, Eyes Wide Shut. That's my 3. And the perfect film is perhaps Dr. Strangelove.